So this is all about odd, isn't it? So this is the class that I would have been giving to you in the Mac lab when we were starting that animation project. Now this is going to be a computer generated animation project using a lot of the same basic principles that you would have used in the first year animation project, albeit instead of working with paper, we're taking that same kind of ideas of cutouts and layers and moving things around, and we're going to be using vector-based illustrations and Photoshop files. We're going to be doing all this within Premiere. Now there is a set of video tutorials covering Premiere. We would have had kind of a bit of a light touch introduction to Premiere before a deeper dive in what we're doing. So I suggest if you don't already know how Premiere works, you watch those 6 videos just to get kind of an idea of how Premiere operates, because we're not going to be covering project setup or the workspace or how a normal live action shot edit project would work. We're just going to be dealing solely with Premiere as an animation program. Now Premiere isn't an animation program. Premiere is a video editor, but what it does have is the ability to keyframe. It also has the ability to pull in Photoshop files and deal with transparencies and layers. And these are 2 really crucial things, because if we're able to bring in layers and transparencies and keyframes, we can move stuff. As soon as you can move it, you've got yourself an animation. We're just looking for motion graphics. We're not looking for character-based stuff. Think of this as movie titles, sequences, the stuff you see at the end of films, like at the end of The Incredibles, when it's all very basic graphic illustration, selling the tone and the visual style of the piece, hinting at story, but not character-based. This isn't cartoon animation, this is motion graphics, but telling a story. Let's get to it. We're going to need a few basic things kind of set before we start, in terms of our frame size and our resolution, and a kind of a rough idea of how the keyframes are going to work. We're going to be making a limited animation. Now, limited style animation uses simple elements sparsely to speed the process up. We're going to be using Premiere. For this kind of animation, we don't tend to think of Premiere as the first program to go to. We usually use After Effects. Now, After Effects is an incredibly competent animation motion graphics program, but a common mistake is people trying to push too much through an After Effects composition and trying to create an entire animation only using After Effects. A typical workflow doesn't rely on a single program. Normally, Premiere will send clips to After Effects will adjust and amend those as a composition, and that will be dynamically linked to Premiere, so any changes made in After Effects will be automatically visible within Premiere. Premiere then takes all of these individual clips and assembles a full edit, as Premiere is the assembly program, After Effects is the animation program. We, however, in this project are only using Premiere. That is because whilst Premiere is an editing program, a lot of the things we're doing in limited animation can be accomplished within Premiere itself. So let's talk about how Premiere is going to achieve this. Now, Premiere has a video frame, and if we place any visual, video or still that is larger than that video frame, it won't automatically scale to show the whole original image. We can move it around, and we use a process called keyframing to help us move individual graphic elements either around or they're changing their scale, and thus create movement. So how do keyframes work? Every single clip, whether it's a still graphic or a video, has attributes such as its position, scale and rotation. A keyframe says that one of those attributes is equal to a certain thing at a certain point in time. So we can set a keyframe, move to a different point in time on the timeline, move the object, and thus create a new keyframe. Then the software will move that asset between those 2 keyframes as we play through the timeline. Now, when creating graphics to do this, there's a few things we need to bear in mind, one of which is the aspect ratio. The aspect ratio is the ratio of how wide to how tall our video frame is. Our video is a 16:9 frame. This is full HD, which is a resolution of 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. The next thing we need to be aware of is the frame rate. The frame rate is how many still images we need to make 1 second of footage. We need to know this when we're setting up our sequences. The standard for video in the UK is 25 frames per second. So I'm starting off with some basic vector artwork. Now this I've created in Illustrator, but the artwork can be created in Photoshop. It can be based off of hand-drawn elements that are scanned in. How the artwork is generated is irrelevant. There are a few important factors though, and they are layering and transparency. Now I have this layer here just as a background white, but each of these layers is surrounded by a fair amount of transparency. Now this is important because if we export, in this instance from Illustrator as a PNG file, then that transparency will be saved. That transparency is known as the alpha channel, and Premiere can read that and apply that transparency information within Premiere, allowing us to utilize layers in the exact same fashion. Now I've drawn a background, a midground, and a foreground element. The idea being that this shot is going to be a tracking shot. We're going to be traveling from the left towards the right across our city, and we're doing that by having an artwork that is longer than the native resolution of our video, so I can drag this layer back and forth across my Premiere video frame to create the idea of horizontal lateral movement. I have a background, a foreground, and a midground. The idea being that objects in the midground would move slower. I have a background, midground, and foreground. The idea being that objects in the foreground would move past much quicker than objects in the background. So I'm going to be able to create a sense perspective in depth. This effect is called parallax, where we move things at a different pace, left and right, to suggest things are further away than others. I've already exported each of these elements as PNG files. I've already exported all of these elements as PNG files. I also have created a plain background plate to sit behind everything. And I've also created an element of the robot Maria. Now, while this isn't in landscape, this is a portrait graphic artwork, it is still significantly larger in resolution than our native video frame. To give you an idea, the artboard for this exported is 3000 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. So our native video frame is 1920 wide. So our video frame is over 1000 pixels wider than the video frame, which gives us ample space. To move these elements laterally. If I wanted to do a vertical tilt, I would do the same thing but increase the size of my artboard vertically. And if I wanted to move it around horizontally and vertically, I would just create something massively larger, maybe like 4000 by 6000, for example, to give me space to move elements around. So, as I've said, it doesn't matter how this artwork is created. This could be analog illustrations, photographed or scanned in, and then cut out in Photoshop so that transparency layer is present. It could be fully drawn in Illustrator, fully digitally painted in Photoshop. Irrelevant, as long as we have access to each individual element you wish to move. The more elements you wish to move, the more you're going to have to separate your artwork out. So if I wanted a different building to move differently to this one, for example, to kind of have things spread out, I would have to create a layer each of those objects. In the same way as in the original animation project in first year, where we had to explode out any characters or movement and break them into each individual component, the more complex the move, the more parts I need to create. The exact same principle applies here. So bear that in mind. The more complex your motion, the more elements and parts you're going to need. So here's the project that I created, that demo animation you saw at the start. It's quite a complex project, but there are actually very few elements within it. I'm using nested sequences for each shot, a separate element to act as a custom transition, and this is all basic keyframes. There's nothing complex about the movement. It's all about layering of texture and building up that visual density by having lots of layers and lots of different graphic elements, albeit all of those elements being quite simple and the number that I'm using being quite low, just reusing them in different manners. So let's dive into it and start from scratch and build one of these shots. Let's start with this horizontal tracking shot. Now I'm using nested sequences here. That means I have a whole sequence of each of my layers, each of my video tracks operating as normal, but instead of having all of these and then another bunch of 6 or 7 for the next shot, I can just go and take the sequence itself and place it like a conventional video clip. When you're working with animation or complex sequences, this is a crucial way of working as it simplifies the workspace and your edit itself, but also compartmentalizes things. So if I want to make a subtle change, then I can make that on an individual shot-by-shot basis, and then that be carried through to that shot's usage in my full compiled edit. Even if it's as simple as hiding a layer, or that change will be carried across. So let's create a new sequence to nest within this. I'm going to go File, New Sequence. And amongst my sequence presets, the digital SLR 1080p 25 will give me a solid baseline of full HD to work from. Give your sequence a name because you're going to have lots of them. And hopefully this will have demonstrated already, if you hadn't done this previously, that Premiere can have multiple sequences within one project. Each sequence can be a part or a full edit. They could be different drafts of an edit or different edits completely using the same raw material, but that then allows us to keep everything neat and tidy within one single project. If I want to create a different edit, I don't have to create a whole new Premiere project. I just create a new sequence within an existing project that uses the same media. So this is a nice way again of compartmentalizing things within your project, having different drafts. I've got a folder here where all of my artwork is. I have separate subfolders for textures or for graphic elements. Now here is our video frame. Transparency in Premiere, unlike in Illustrator or in Photoshop, isn't rendered as a white and grey checkboard. Transparent, no information is black. So if I have a graphic element of transparency information, if I drag that element in, where I can't see, where there's nothing there, will still be rendered as black. If I take another graphic element and place it on a lower track, you can see quite clearly how the transparency information travels across. So there's my background plate, there's a layer on top. Now you'll notice it looks like it's cropped this top layer, this graphic here. That's because this graphic is larger in resolution than our video frame, which means it doesn't automatically scale it down, it doesn't constrain it in any ways, it just centrally places it, and if it goes over the edges of our video frame, it is essentially cropped. So the first thing we may want to do is to move this around to position it correctly. Any adjustment to the position of a layer or a clip or anything like that will be made in the Effect Controls tab up here. The Effect Controls tab displays any variable attribute that a clip or still graphic has. It will display those for whatever clip you have highlighted. So if I deselect, I have no attributes that I can change. But whatever attribute I have selected, it relates to that clip. Always ensure your playhead is over the clip you have selected, otherwise any changes you make won't be visible. Every visual clip, whether it's a video or a still image, has basic attributes of motion and opacity. Motion includes things such as its position on the screen, its scale and rotation. The opacity controls are, as you would expect, opacity, but also blend modes. And the blend modes will be the exact same blend modes that you'll be familiar with from Photoshop and Illustrator, and they work in the exact same fashion. More on that later. Now every attribute has a numerical value. So scale, I can scale something up, or I can scale it down. If I go over 100%, I am scaling up, and I will be bringing in poorer quality as it's having to upscale the image. Scale it down, there's no impact on image quality, so you can always downscale, but never take this number over 100 if you can at all avoid it. The position has two numbers, the horizontal and the vertical. I'm adjusting these by clicking on the number, holding down my mouse and then dragging left or right. However, if I select the word motion or the attribute of position or scale, I get a bounding box and it gets a bit more intuitive that I can drag it around in a way that I'll be more familiar with. Sometimes I just want to position something. Sometimes I want to keyframe it. So let's keyframe this so it moves. I'm going to take my playhead, this blue line that shows where we are in the video. I'm going to take it to the start of this clip, of this graphic image. And up here we have a miniature timeline that relates to just this clip. So as I play through, you'll see it tracks too. Every attribute I can adjust has this little toggle switch to toggle animation on. And this allows me to save keyframes. So if I turn that on, I now have a little half diamond, or a little diamond icon here. This is a keyframe. This keyframe says, at this point in time of this clip, its position is this. If I then move my playhead forward in time, and then change its position, it will then create a fresh keyframe. And we now have this blue motion path. This path shows the direction of travel that this is going to go on. If I now move from one keyframe to the next, that graphic element will now move. The closer keyframes are together, the faster something will move to complete that animation. The further apart they are, the slower that animation will take to complete. We can have multiple keyframes. And once keyframing is turned on, I don't have to then tell it to create any additional keyframes. Any change I make will automatically generate a new keyframe. And I can keyframe in multiple assets at the same time. So I have this coming down and then back up in a gentle curve, But I could also, for example, keyframe its scale, starting at 100 and ending at 70, which gives the suggestion that I'm moving away from this object. So if I now take in another graphic element, I would then repeat the process. This is midground, so elements that are closer to our viewer. So closer elements would move faster. So they would still be closer to the camera, so the scaling might be less. And I can start to build up layers and density. A little trick. A little trick here. On our transport controls, if you press the plus button, you get other controls you can bring in. And you'll find there's this loop control. And if you go to the end of a clip and press O for out, turn on looping, then it'll loop from the start to the end of that out point. This is particularly useful when we're dealing with animation because you're going to be making minute changes and then you have to watch over it again and again and decide if that has made a positive or negative difference. Now I might quite like the motion here, but these elements are very clean. So I might want to add a bit of texture. So I'm going to space these elements out on my timeline and I'm going to bring in some textures. I'm going to start with this one here. I'm going to bring it in and I'm going to go to my effect controls. I'm going to rotate this by 90 degrees, turning it on its side, and I'm going to scale it so that it fills my frame. Now this is a monochromatic image, which is perfect for blend modes. For example, if I suggest darken, I can then have a really dense smog that only parts of the buildings are visible through. If I suggest lighten, I can do the opposite and only have elements of that smog revealed by darker parts of the layers below. So by adjusting my blend modes, I can start to build visual texture. It also again helps to suggest depth by placing texture between visual elements. There would be smog and atmospherics, smoke in between things, so things further in the distance would be paler than things in the foreground, for example. I can also obviously keyframe any movement of this smog, so it's not just static visual texture, but suggesting that it's real atmospherics present in the environment. One of the few situations that you can scale up and generally get away with it is when adding textures. Just a little bit of grit in the lens, just add a bit of texture and realism to the image, albeit completely stylized, impossible in reality, but just that little bit of texture gives the eye something to hold on to and helps build visual density. Let's bring in another element. I have this PNG of the Maria robot. Bring that in. And I'm going to position her so that she's standing unmoving as the city whirls around her, leaving just her as the city speeds away into the distance. Now, I might want to add some effects to this. Now, all effects, as I've already said, operate like adjustment layers, and all effects are accessed from this effects tab down here. The effects in Premiere are organized into transitions and effects, video and audio. If we look in video effects, there's an awful lot of stuff. And sometimes it's hard to find what you're looking for. So there's a search bar at the top, so you have a rough idea of what you're looking for. You can take that and bring it in. To apply an effect, we simply click and drag it onto the layer or asset that we want to apply it to and let go. In the effect controls, as well as the motion and opacity, we now have the effect that we've just applied. I'm going to zoom in here so I can get a better look at how that's working. So in this instance, I've applied a glow, and the colours are wrong, so it doesn't look quite right. So I'm going to take that, and I'm going to eyedrop a colour that's on the edge of the artwork itself. You can change the size, the brightness of the glow. I can be quite dramatic with the colour of it. It kind of works in this instance. All artworks, whether they are PNG or scanned image, no matter how they're made, all of them are going to work in the exact same fashion. So that means everything we can edit in Premiere is edited in the same fashion. Doesn't matter if it's a video clip or a still image. That means that standard 5 seconds that we bring stuff in, we can make it longer. Likewise, anything we can apply to a video, we can apply here. So if I want to take a dissolve, put a dissolve onto something, I can use that to fade elements away. Ensure any fade is finished before a keyframe movement is complete, otherwise be a little bit of a jump. And the more complex, the more layers you have. In this instance, I've used the exact same elements multiple times. I have the background element of the buildings. I have the textural element, and just repeating those with the statue in between, with the foreground element in the front, and a bit of texture again in the front layer, with a mixture of blend modes to create this image of the city sinking away with the rise of Maria, thus hinting at parts of the narrative of the film with a purely visual storytelling. And again, to help sell this shot, there's a few subtle things going on that we'll also talk about. And to help sell this shot, there's a few subtle things we're going to talk about, namely a lens flare. We have essentially what would be the sun as a high exposing element up here, and if a camera lens was looking straight into it, there would be a lens flare. So we've created a lens flare using a basic lens flare effect. We can move around how that flare operates, and that's something that we can keyframe as well. So as the camera moves, the flare would move. As a lens flare, that reflection-y, lighty aberration in the lens would move as the camera itself moved. So it adds a little bit of realism, something that we expect to see in nature, which helps again just sell the shot. Just got this little bit of lens flare here. It's a nice little detail. So play around with the effects, things like that can really help sell a shot and finish it off nicely. Bring in each element into a single sequence. So I created that new sequence here, and bring that in. I can just drag that into place and add it as a single clip. And if I make an adjustment, I can go back to that sequence, make an adjustment, and in my compiled edit, that adjustment is carried across. Once I've finished, ensure there's no further content after the end, or mark out with the O button, or these marking out buttons up here. This will section off how long our edit is and when we're going to export. This will section off how much of our edit we want to export. With that done, click within your timeline, go to the File drop-down menu, Export Media. In the export settings, you can check to make sure there's nothing you don't want to export. So for example, I've got a little black frame there. We can just reset that mark out to ensure there's nothing we don't want to export. With that correct, it's time to dictate our format, our export settings, and our save destination. For web in most situations, H.264 is a good, solid option. They also give us an MP4 file with a commonly used codec that will work on any online platform, Mac or PC, regardless of newness or power of computer. Beneath that we have presets, and these presets are based on distribution channels. So are you placing this video on Vimeo or on YouTube? And there are preset settings that platform has defined as what they would prefer. Now, these settings are essentially the same. If you're in any doubt, the standard at the top, match source, high bitrate, will do you a fine job. Otherwise, pick one that works for what you're doing. After that, we have output name. Click on the blue text, and this is where this is going to be saved. Never put the word final in a file name, it is a curse. With these done, tick use maximum render quality and hit export. Go get a cup of tea, and depending on how complex your edit is, depends how long this will take to complete.